Welcome one more time, and it is my distinct honor to introduce my colleague, CMU's Interim Dean of the College of Engineering, Jeanne Kagan. Thank you.
Well, I'll add my welcome as well. It's a very exciting event, and thank you for being here. Just a couple of, I'm supposed to take less than 5 minutes, and I have to thank Michael because it'll be even shorter now. First off, the College of Engineering, we're very pleased to have 7 different core engineering departments, and all of them are making significant contributions in the area of healthcare. And when we think about science to science fiction, many of these ideas really are making science fiction real today. If it's biomedical engineering to, say, engineering and public policy, mechanical engineering to material and science engineering, electrical computer engineering, civil and environmental engineering, and chemical engineering. And all of those departments have active collaborative research in this area. Next slide, please. So Michael already mentioned this, but let me think about science fiction. And we know that there's going to be a launch to Mars, and there's going to be people living there. And isn't that science fiction to think that maybe somebody all of a sudden needs a new heart? What would happen? Well, with the research going on today, that becomes reality. And so recently, Adam Feinberg led a team whose work was published in Science, and through that work, using collagen, he can 3D print collagen in some of the building blocks of the human heart, and it's one step toward making that even closer. And of course, Keith Cook, who's here and part of the broader team of looking at artificial organs, will be talking in the panel. Or think about the idea of insulin. And Katie White, by the way, Adam's in both biomedical engineering and material science and engineering. Or Katie Whitehead, who's in chemical engineering, and her team has discovered the molecule that makes strawberries red. And that same molecule can safely dilate the pores that are basically in the small intestine to allow insulin to penetrate and into the bloodstream. So it's a key discovery that leads toward this idea of actually an insulin pill. And I could spend the next 45 minutes, which I thought I had, talking about all of the really exciting projects that all are really bringing this notion of science fiction into reality today. But with that, I'm going to have us move on to the panel. And if every one of the participants, please, in the science or science fiction panel could join me on stage. Also joined by moderator Kristen Kurland, who's teaching professor of architecture, information systems, and public policy at CMU's Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy and the School of Architecture.
Thank you, John, and thanks everybody for being here today. We may have one more panelist that we think is on the way, so I'm going to leave the seat at the end there for Jeanne if she's able to make it. So, first of all, some logistics. We're going to do, if you were here earlier this morning, the panel is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion. There's a few questions that I want to make sure that I get in, and then we'll invite some people up to the podium here to ask some more questions. So, science or science fiction, and what will medicine look like in the future, and how will both science and the arts contribute to that? So before we get into this, I want to talk a little bit about Carnegie Mellon, and this has been sort of medicine and science, but I want to talk about how the arts are working with medicine and healthcare today. And we're going to give a few examples, and then I'm going to have the panelists talk a little bit more about what they do, and then we'll get into some questions. So just some examples from my end of the world. So I have a joint appointment between the School of Architecture and the Heinz College and a courtesy appointment in engineering. But the College of Fine Arts is doing a lot of work in the world of health. So in the School of Architecture, we look at healthy buildings, and we look at daylighting, and we look at energy, and we look at using sensors to look at the environment. We have projects going on all around campus. We have 80,000 sensors in our buildings that are capturing all kinds of data. In the world of urban design, we're working with smart cities and healthy cities. And when we talk about smart cities, we look at inclusive citizens and looking at the health of each citizen. Within the School of Design, we have faculty like Kristen Hughes, who is working with community design and engagement. We have people within the School of Music. Steve Neely is working a lot with sound, and we were talking a little bit about that last night. when you look at somebody like the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon, a lot of people think about gaming, but the Entertainment Technology Center does a lot of work around the world of health. We look at gaming for instructing healthcare workers how to better take care of patients, or there are games now that are working on teaching kids with asthma how to better take care of themselves. And of course, at the Heinz College, we do a lot of work around healthcare policy and IT. We have the 412 Food Rescue is an initiative started from an alumna from Carnegie Mellon. And so I could go on, but I think that it's good to understand that here at Carnegie Mellon, we are very interdisciplinary, and there's a lot going on in the world of health, both in the arts and the humanities and public policy. So I want to talk a little bit about us and what we do. So I am a faculty member here. I've been here, celebrating my 25th year here at Carnegie Mellon. I have two worlds. I have the world of architecture, and in that world, what I'm doing is using technologies. I teach a lot of three-dimensional technologies, not only for the design of buildings. I recently did a project with the city planning department to look at using virtual reality to look at teaching citizens or showing citizens what the change to the landscape of the streets might look like. And in that project, I collaborated with the Entertainment Technology Center, some folks within the School of Architecture and the School of Design. I also do what we call geospatial analysis, GIS to some people. I do a lot of work with UPMC and Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and mostly what I do there is I extract medical record data and map it. So if you were here in the panel earlier looking at AI, there was a project going on in England where there was mapping of all kinds of data. You could look at the health of, your health might be contributed to your location. Where do you live? There's all kinds of projects that look at obesity, and I've done studies looking at kids who live close to parks, and we did some studies looking at BMI changes over a 5-year period, and kids who live closer to the park were shown to have a decrease in their body mass index. I also look at things like accidents, pedestrian accidents, and this led to work that the city is doing with parks. And again, I don't know if you know this, but the mayor is looking at making sure that there's a park in every Pittsburgh neighborhood, looking at the complete streets, whether you like it or not. All of the streets that are including bike lanes now is something that we look at to make it safer for those who want to bicycle. I also do work looking at patients who don't show for visits. So I did a project recently with Children's Hospital looking at mapping where these patients are coming from and looking at what's happening in those neighborhoods. Also looking at high utilizers in the emergency department to try and figure out where those patients are coming from. And then lastly, I also teach in a program called the Master of Medical Management, and these are for physician executives. This is at the Heinz College. They're physician executives who are now in leadership roles. And one of the courses that I teach is a course showing them how the building infrastructures are important, but also how this geospatial technology can help in their decision making. And by the way, that program is now in its 20th year, and it's really interesting to see the physicians that have changed over those 20 years. Back in 1999 when the program started, the medical record system was much different than it is today. And so it's really interesting to see how the management of healthcare has evolved. And with that, I see that Jeanne has arrived. So talking about healthcare management, I'm going to give a little break and ask her to join us here on the stage. And I'd like to first of all, introduce everybody, and then we'll go around and have everybody tell a little bit more about what they do. So to my left here is Keith Cook. Keith is a professor and associate department head for graduate education in biomedical engineering here at Carnegie Mellon. We have Barbara Shinn-Cunningham to his left. She is the director of the Carnegie Mellon Neuroscience Institute, professor in the Center for the Neurobasis of Cognition, Biomedical Engineering, Psychology, and Electrical and Computer Engineering. I think you win the prize for having the most appointments here. Yeah, in August, yeah. We have Steve Downs, who, if you were here today, gave a great keynote talk this morning. He's the Chief Technology and Strategy Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And just arriving was Jeanne Cunicelli, who's the Vice President at UP Enterprises and also a member of the Carnegie Mellon Board of Trustees. So with that, I'm going to ask Keith to maybe spend a few minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about your research and work.
Sure, thank you very much. So in addition to being a professor in biomedical engineering, I lead the Bioengineered Organs Initiative here at CMU. And the Bioengineered Organs Initiative focuses on developing organs that are capable of permanent support. And those might be artificial organs, they might be completely tissue-based organs, or something in between.
And I'm Barbara Shinn-Cunningham. As I was introduced, I'm the director of the Neuroscience Institute, which is a new institute here at Carnegie Mellon. My job in that role is to bring together and grow neuroscience here. Because we're Carnegie Mellon, that means there's a strong technology focus, a strong data science focus on that as well. In my own work, I'm an electrical engineer by background, but over the course of my career, I've turned into a neuroscientist, never having had a neuroscience course in my life, and not having any bio course since 10th grade. But whether that's a good thing or bad, I leave that to you. But in my own work, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, meaning I study human brain reactions to sound. I actually study attention and how attention controls what you're hearing. I worry very much about healthcare. A lot of the application areas for my own work is in people who have hearing impairment or other communication disorders, but there's other applications as well to things like devices that can help even normal hearing people or people who are neurotypical communicate better in hard environments.
So there's hope for me if you became a nerd. So Steve, if you were here this morning, you heard plenty of my point of view. But I thought I actually just sort of set up my participation in this panel is actually talk a little bit about how I think and why I think the way I think. I'm a generalist by nature. I was trained in physics undergrad. And so that means I think in systems and in patterns and in forces. And then my my master's degree is in technology and public policy. And so I'm always sort of thinking about sort of socio-political, economic implications and contexts for technology. So looking forward to having some of that discussion in our panel.
Hi, I'm Jeanne Cunicelli. Am I on? I am. And I apologize for being late. If you know me, you're not surprised, but I still apologize.
You're perfect. You're
It was
right
for
on.
you, Michael. Yeah. As mentioned, I am a trustee here. I'm fortunate enough to be a trustee here at Carnegie Mellon. I also attended Carnegie Mellon as an undergrad, probably, so many years ago now, it's hard to believe. But my perspective is that I've been an investor in life sciences companies, so the biology underlying the decisions doctors make, the course of treatment you may all take. And throughout the course of my career, I've followed where the digital part of this intersects with more of the biology. So as an investor, I think, first and foremost, how do you generate returns? How do you make money? But more importantly, and I think most importantly, with all this access to data, with information about our biology, with things that are kind of never a secret anymore, how can you make money in a good way, right? How do you make sure that ethics and judgment are behind every decision you make? And so I can't promise that all of us as investors make our decisions that way, but I know at UPMC, where we think about that a lot because we are the nexus with healthcare. UPMC is both a provider and a payer, that these are things we have to think about daily. Patients data, how we use that information, and as the head of their translational sciences investment arm, I have to think about the right way to invest in areas where they are going to apply their knowledge.
Thank you. So, this is looking at science and science fiction, 10, 20, 50 years from now. But, I always like to remind us of where we've come from. And, one of the examples that I always give in my course, I teach a course on health GIS, and I always start with John Snow in 1854. And if you're familiar with that story, it was mapping cholera in London in 1854. And the theory there was that it was an airborne disease, and in fact, it was a contaminated water pump. And one of the things that reminds me of is that some of the biggest strides in medicine come from engineering and sanitation. And I think that one of the things that I want the panel to continue to think about is, how do we do this with an interdisciplinary theme to it and a collaboration? Because, health is not only looking at the science of medicine, it's also about all of these other disciplines that we bring into it. So, Barb, I'm going to start with you. So in my work, I'm working with a student right now whose senior thesis is looking at how to better design clinic space for the interaction between patients and physicians. I'm also working with a clinician at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh looking at how clinic space affects the health of the employees. So how does it affect the health of physicians and nurses and social workers who are in those clinic spaces all day long? Can you talk a little bit from your world how you see technological advances changing how clinicians and patients interact with some of these new technologies that are out?
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting. One of the things in my world, I worry a lot about sound perception. When you talk about that environment, actually sound design is a big part of it. How many of you have heard an alarm and then you get so disgusted by the alarm and inured to the alarm you stop paying attention to the alarm? Well, it turns out a lot of medical devices have that exact problem. And there are actually people working on designing soundscapes that allow these alarms to be heard and interpreted more naturally and not be ignored when they should not be ignored and things like that. So that's kind of an interesting aside. But one of the things I think is most fascinating to think about is how technology changes and sensor changes will allow us to deliver healthcare to people that currently aren't in a typical clinical setting. And that's something, again, from my own experience, I know having a smartphone actually allows you to do audiological testing remotely through a phone, which can deliver some diagnostic information from somebody in a remote space to somebody who is knowledgeable and can diagnose the problem. So that kind of thing, that the fact that there are sensors that people carry around with them today and that the sensor technology is getting smaller and cheaper and is being embedded in devices that we're becoming more and more comfortable with having on us at all times is really going to have an impact not just in hearing but in all sorts of places. So that's, I think, a really interesting thing to think about. Related to that, we are getting more and more used to not just carrying a phone, but having an earbud in our ear. Well, it turns out it's really quite trivial to put an accelerometer in that device, to put an electrode that can read signals coming off of the brain in that device. That's the kind of thing that allows you to detect if somebody's fallen down if they have that device on them. So there are all sorts of things where remote sensing is actually something that will change delivery in a pretty pronounced way. And I'd take it in even a step further. Diagnostics are one thing, but delivering healthcare to an individual at a remote site is actually something I think about as well. A lot of the work that we do is trying to understand how a human receives information in a natural way and then can deliver either actual physical palpitations to someone or interact with someone who's remote. You can imagine building devices that a person interfaces with that can control surgery. That is not far-fetched. In fact, people, even when there are some surgeries where robotic devices are actually doing the surgery, there's no reason, if we can deal with communication delays, that surgical robot could be remote. And again, you have somebody who's very valuable and whose expertise is very unique, sitting in one location, but actually doing interactions with a patient far away. So this seems scary almost and sci-fi, but actually, if we can solve some of the technological problems, it would be as effective as being in the same room as that surgical robot. So these are the kinds of things that I, as an electrical engineer, when I put on that kind of hat, think about what it really means. As a cognitive neuroscientist, it actually turns out you need somebody with that kind of expertise as well, because a big part of that interaction is the human operator, it is the human surgeon, and making sure that they're getting the quality of information they need and with the timing that they need to be able to be effective in that kind of situation.
Sorry, at one level, it's probably not all that, it's probably different in some respects, certainly, but like drone pilots in Las Vegas.
Absolutely.
Right?
No, absolutely. And in fact, I sometimes get money from agencies like Department of Defense to worry about exactly that. And as somebody who studies attention, for instance, there are a lot of accidents that happen with a drone pilot or even a regular pilot where information is available to the human operator, but they don't notice. because they're focused on something that seems so important. The example I often give for my own work is a plane where the pilot was trying to land in really terrible weather, and the co-pilot quietly, politely sat next to him and said repeatedly, "You're landing on the wrong runway." And the pilot was so focused on the bad weather, he never heard the co-pilot. It's very audible on the black box recordings, but he was focused on a really important task, landing the plane. It turned out it was on the wrong runway, and many, many people were killed. So information may be available to the human, yet not processed, and that's a really important idea to have in your mind when you're designing these kinds of remote systems that have a human in the loop.
You know, this brings up to a good question about, you know, this interaction and where it happens. And I'm going to kind of lead towards Jeanne now with my next question. So one of the project that I'd worked on was looking at, again, why these kids at Children's Hospital, it was a study of a clinic here in Oakland, and they weren't showing up. There were multiple times they weren't showing up for well visits. And so we mapped where they were coming from, so we knew where those neighborhoods were. But then UPMC funded a focus group, and we had a focus group that really went and talked to the patients themselves, because we had these ideas that it was transportation and it was all kinds of other issues. Well, it turns out one of the big issues was scheduling, and the other issue was, there were two other smaller issues. One was just the lack of continuity of seeing the same physician, because this was a resident clinic. And then also they were saying that they you know, wanted to really have this in an area that was more accessible. So that project ended up opening a clinic in the Homewood neighborhood, and every Monday the same clinician and nurse would go to that neighborhood and see those patients. So, you know, if you think back on how healthcare was delivered in the past, you had the doctor, the family doctor visited the home. What do you think in the future? You know, I mean, brick and mortar costs a lot, and we look at these hospitals, and do you have an idea of how you see the future of medicine being and the interaction?
So, you know, part of me is such a traditionalist. I hate the idea of the lack of eyeball to eyeball. So, Barbara, hearing you mention that there's a human behind the surgery suite, it's very important. But the other thing that kept jumping out at me was exactly that: accessibility, accessibility, accessibility. Whether it's access to care, specialists, right? There's your general practitioner whom we all see. They weigh you. They tell you if your blood pressure is any okay. Then if something's wrong, they refer you into a specialist. I truly think that nexus is going to change. The GP will still be important. In fact, maybe even more so, because how they serve as that conduit to specialists will be critical. With specialists, it seems to me that, thanks to the work of a lot of people here, you'll have access in a way you hadn't previously. So you may still need the bricks and mortars for access when you need it. And then with specialists, I would anticipate you don't have to worry about the scheduling as much. We, at Enterprises, for instance, take a lot of time looking at what we're calling telemedicine, right? It's just a fancy word for access to a care provider via digital means, any way that you need it. And I think that the more we can do that, the better off we're going to be. The impact along the value continuum, including people understanding about their own health. We are entering an era where it's very popular to say the patient owns their health, the patient owns their health. Talk to people in Homewood if they think they own their health, right? So good, it normalizes and evens the playing field. So back to that word accessibility. And the next place I think it's super important is one of the biggest issues. As we help all of us live longer, not sure all of us want me around longer given my tardiness, but I'm still sorry about that. But
You weren't tardy, you're fine. Yeah, you were right on time as far as I saw.
then maybe we do want me around longer. So
You're just mimicking some doctors who are always running late.
who are always running late, exactly. Well, that may change. But again, at each point in the continuum, one of the other pieces is compliance. So to stay alive longer, to make cancer a chronic disease, to really manage what we know of as chronic diseases, accessibility to this type of care is critical, as is, you know, fixing this compliance issue with chronic meds. And quite frankly, accessibility to things that, it's not just genetics, it's environment. How can we give better accessibility? Can UPMC be a tool in providing a better accessibility to health, food, water, whatever it may be? So I I think what you're bringing up is so critical because I do think of it as even the playing field. And a place like UPMC has to think 20 years in the future because the brick and mortar is expensive and there's a lot of people on the planet and we're getting more and more. We probably don't have enough beds. Right, so there's lots of elements in that, but do not underscore or cannot underscore enough accessibility on all fronts.
Right, yeah. So I'm all for robotic surgery. I just had a demonstration at UPMC looking at, and I think what's interesting about that is, you could go into rural areas where, surgery might not be available and you could have somebody, an expert doing this surgery. Before I became an architect, actually, I was a chemistry major at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1980s. And one of the research projects I worked on was with Dr. Thomas Starzl. And at the time, we were talking about, science or science fiction. And by the way, there's a great documentary about Tom Starzl that's out now. And, he was criticized, in the beginning. And it was, this whole world of transplantation and, transplanting organs. I'm not sure I would want to have a liver or a lung transplant done remotely by a robot. I don't know, that's just me, but some other things might be great. But, Keith, it's going to lead into a question that I have for you. And, with the advancements and the work that you're doing related to tissue-based medical products and cellular therapies, how's that going to change the world of transplantation? Is it going to be in the future where I could just, go to Amazon and order a new liver and have it delivered and have the local doctor
By
transplant
drone.
that?
Extra large.
Right, yeah, exactly. Are we going to have, there's, I know that you've said, that there aren't that many lung transplants that are happening in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about this and how you see organ shortages and that whole world?
Yeah, certainly. So we're definitely working on it, and definitely if we're selling one of those, Amazon's probably going to sell one too. So I work primarily on artificial lungs. That's my main area of research. And I do a lot of work on trying to get those lungs to really be more stealthy so that the body doesn't identify them as foreign. Our bodies are excellent at walling things off and separating them from the rest of our body. But you've seen some of the work of Adam Feinberg here. And, in working on artificial lungs, if there is a way to not make them stealthy, but actually make them the tissue of the patient, then why wouldn't we do it that way? And from my standpoint, the artificial lungs I work on look nothing like your natural lungs. The structures are different, the materials are different. And so for me, it's just a unique design opportunity to say, well, what if instead of making this lung out of plastics, then instead we make it completely out of biological tissue. Now, Dr. Feinberg, and you saw his amazing work here, comes at it from, I think, more of a tissue engineering perspective, where Adam is trying to engineer the tissues in a more biological form. And so Adam and I, and a number of excellent CMU researchers, some of which are in the room, have come together and really tried to blend those approaches so that the concept is that we're going to try to get to a mass manufacturable organ. And if we're trying to completely recapitulate the native structure of that organ, that's going to be very challenging. And so maybe what we can do instead of this is try and do something that's a hybrid. It doesn't look like an artificial organ, it doesn't look like the natural organ, but it's something that we can build and we can ultimately mass manufacture. And so what really enables us to do that is people like Adam. Adam Feinberg invented a fresh printing process that allows for printing of soft biological tissues, which was never possible before. And then we've worked with a number of other faculty to try and put that on a mass manufacturing platform. And there's been a lot of investment from the federal government to make tissue-based products a reality, particularly in the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army. They've invested in this Advanced Regenerative Medicine Institute, also known as BioFab USA. say what you will about the name, but that's the name, BioFab USA, and they've put $80 million into them putting tissue-based medical products on commercial footing. And so they've also invested in large-scale cell manufacturing. And so I do think in the time frame of maybe 10 years, we're going to see, I mean, we're already starting to see commercial tissue-based products, but we're going to see it being much more prevalent. And then thereafter is when we will start to see larger tissues and ultimately mass manufactured organs.
So
can I just add, that's a great intersect with, we at UPMC have an initiative, you may have heard of it, it's called the Immune Transplant and Therapy Center, so it's not so far-fetched from what you're discussing, but you referenced something which is the body's pretty smart at recognizing antigens, foreign things. Do you ever see a world where we're not going to need the immunosuppressants for such tissue? I get asked that all the time, so I'm going to throw it to you because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I think there's the promise and then there's the practical there. And we debated this. We debated this amongst the scientists who work on this, whether our approach was to first go for something that was going to be, patient comes in, cells are harvested, we grow up their stem cells, and they get an individualized organ. That's going to be exceedingly expensive and time-consuming. So it may be feasible. And so if you're quite wealthy, maybe you have that done, and then you don't use immunosuppression on that organ. Probably a more realistic first approach is that we have essentially a selection of organs that are all HLA matched, and so you come in, your antigens are identified, you get that type of organ, and so that way we're not making a single organ for a single person.
Yeah, and if you look at the time frame, I mean, Tom Starzl, that was 30 years ago. And so, projecting out 30 years, we're going to look back and say, remember the days where, there weren't artificial organs? And so it's really interesting to see this type of work. Steve, I'd like to get your thoughts on sort of how society is going to have to change to adapt to some of these new thoughts about, this telemedicine, not even telemedicine, but maybe using augmented or virtual reality to have interactions, and you're a guy that's this hybrid of technology and society. Can you?
Well, it's funny. I was actually thinking even more about organs. Yeah, no. Well, but I think how we react to that, and so part of what I was thinking as I was listening to you talk was. Sort of why are we limiting ourselves to existing organs? And I know that's kind of a weird question, but yeah, but hold it for a second. No, essentially what I'm getting into is sort of the notion of enhancement, and and enhancement exists today. I'm wearing eyeglasses, and it's been around for a long time. But I think about some of the neuroscience stuff that you're doing, and so I talked this morning about this idea that we aren't actually evolved for the environment we've created, and my answer to this is sort of like, maybe we should try to shift the environment slightly so it aligns better with our species. There are also others who say, well, we should just accelerate our evolution. We should do the adaptation. We should create people who don't get diabetes. We should do all sorts of things. We should grow eyes on the back of our heads because they may be useful. And so this sort of question of sort of what is a human, sounds kind of silly right today, but I mean there are serious people who are talking about sort of forking the species, in that and this comes up. Juan Enriquez is an example. He talks about if we're going to go to Mars, we need to start designing humans who can actually survive Mars, and we need to kind of start doing that now. So okay, this is kind of like sounds like whack science fiction, right? Yeah, but again, from a societal perspective, when we run into these questions about, everybody should have access to health and health care, in effect, it's almost like, although to be frank, we haven't really arrived at this notion that we all have the right to be repaired. But it is sort of a repair paradigm.
Yeah.
And it's not, we all have the right to have turbocharged legs,
Well, yeah, Barb,
so-
can you talk a little bit about this? Because I think, in your area, how are scientists developing new ways to read and write the brain signals? And if it's altered, what's going to happen? I mean, this is getting into some of the ethical questions that, Jeanne brings up. Is it okay to fix Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's a great, right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain things that I think everyone could agree. If somebody has a disease state and we had a way to fix it by changing the brain, I think most people would say that's ethical and reasonable. But we really are at the cusp, and there's a lot of great research here at CMU on changing how the brain is responding to things, or writing into the brain information, reading from the brain information. So this is not really that much science fiction. You may not believe how close we are. And there's some really interesting work going on here in biomedical engineering and electrical engineering. Numbers of people are working on that here, really creating new ways of reading information and writing information into your brain. And that does get into this question of augmentation. Fixing a disease state, I think everybody would agree. But what if I can nudge what it is you're thinking about? Maybe I change you from daydreaming to being back focused on a task, right? I mean, that's a scary thought, but actually we're getting closer. Right now, today, people are getting deep brain stimulation where people with Parkinson's disease, which is a disease interfering with your movement, they're getting implanted electrodes into their brain that are permanent. And what those electrodes are doing is disrupting an abnormal rhythm that sets up in the brain in these Parkinson's patients who are missing certain cells, a certain neurotransmitter that puts the brain into this state of getting into oscillations, literally just rhythmic oscillations that are atypical, that interfere with the initiation of motor movement. And it turns out if you disrupt those oscillations, you can give these people back the ability to move to some degree. And so that happens today, and everybody can buy into that's a great thing. But it turns out, first of all, we can do better by knowing more about the specific mechanisms of those oscillations, and some of the work for Aaron Giddis is a biologist here who's doing really great work looking at exactly which neurons are affected, which subpopulations are affected, what the neural dynamics are of the little network that's getting into this abnormal state, why is it in that state, so that you can target these stimulations better. So by looking at the underlying basic science, we can make more specific interventions that are more effective. So that's a great thing. Again, we're all agreeing that's a good thing. But now you have an electrode in the brain that's permanent. You could read from that electrode as well as write to that electrode. Here we're writing to it in a very similar, all we're doing is disrupting an abnormal state right now, but there are electrodes out there that do more than that, and they're implanted in animals now. And in fact, there are people who are paraplegic, or quadriplegic, locked-in patients who have received implants into their brain to allow them to produce speech by thinking about the motor commands that they would use if they could. And again, sounds like a great thing, wonderful that they're getting back function that they're missing. But that kind of thing could be used for people who don't have disease, for people who are neurotypical people. So and I was just talking to Steve before we came on stage, one of the things that's unfortunate is that a lot of scientists are really focused on the science and don't talk enough about the consequences of that science. My husband works in cybersecurity, and privacy issues are a huge piece, and some of the technology got away from them before privacy protections were in place. And we're at a point right now where we need to think about that for neural engineering as well as other forms of healthcare interventions. So,
by the way, if people have questions, we can start to line up if there are people that have questions. But I do want to just ask Keith, another thing here. This brings up a good point. You can't just work in a silo of scientific, medicine. And I think that's one of the great things that we do at Carnegie Mellon. We open this up to interdisciplinary work. My work is with physicians and designers and architects. In your world, what do you think about how healthcare research is going to look in the future? How the different academic areas? We talk about engineering and medicine, but how does psychology or computer science or business and all of this come into play? Do you think? You have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that as biomedical engineers, or just engineers in general who work in the healthcare area, we're used to working with clinicians and getting their perspective. But I think more and more, if you really want your work to be translational, you really have to have a greater group of experts in your work, and they can really cut across almost any area. Our research is far more complex than it used to be. The delivery systems are far more complex than they used to be. And so there's so many different areas. And so, for us, for example, the Bioengineered Organs Initiative, we have to have people who are in computer science who work on robotics, who work on machine learning, AI. We have to have experts in ethics, because that's certainly a big part of what we do. We have to have experts in FDA regulations. That's ever changing. And I could tell you what it is right now, not very well, but I could tell you what it is right now, and a year from now it'll be totally different. So I think on the research area, it's actually gotten somewhat complex writing grants to work on things, because you can't possibly cram in all the experts you need on a grant with budgets as they are. So you always go into it knowing we got a little deficit here. We'll have to ask someone if they'll just offer some free advice.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have a question here?
Yeah, free advice. I've been offering that for a long time, so here it goes.
Oh, wait, can you tell us who you are?
Oh, yes. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Horansky-Beck. I'm a neurodevelopmental optometrist. I'm an embodied yoga teacher, and I'm a somatic movement therapist. I just got a master's degree in spirituality and live food nutrition to reverse chronic illness. I honor the work that everybody here does, not just the panel, but the whole audience. We are all experts that are so disconnected from ourselves that we have gone awry. The medical models are disease models. What about embracing the preventative health precautionary principle model in all you on the panel and everybody does? I'm asking us all to look deeply inside, to the cellular level, the cells that exist in our body now, not the nano-manipulated particles that we are putting into our bodies without knowing the consequences, unintended consequences. The science fiction is the disconnection within ourselves. That is what is going on. I'm going to just spout off some elephants in the room because I'm not a speaker up on the stage. 5G, smart cities. Dr. Deborah Davis, the disconnect. Look up the Environmental Health Trust, all of my friends in this room. A plant-based lifestyle, the game changers. Go see it on Monday. It'll be in Pittsburgh. It's about vegan athletes like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Look up Dr. Michael Greger, nutritionfacts.org, the importance of the plant-based lifestyle in reversing chronic illness. And petrochemicals and single-use plastics. One of the sponsors here had single-use plastics available to us today to use. Mr. Downs, you were a fantastic keynote. It was fabulous. Just so you should know, salmon naturally, in their life cycle, as a biologist, we know that's what they do. What salmon do is that they jump high in the air and they go over the waterfalls. That's normal. What we humans have done is put dams in the system They can't do that anymore. The indigenous populations are starving. We need to take the dams out of this conversation, switch the paradigms up, and then the artificial intelligence needs to be within and in the context of the paradigms of humanity. So I don't really have a question. There were just so many sticking points in today that I needed to put into the room so that we can think with our own minds and brains before the AI comes in to help us.
Yeah, thank you. So Jeanne?
Yeah, well, thank you. Let me just start by saying one of the unfortunate parts of what we all do right now is we are not in a proactive mode as it comes to managing health and managing disease, right? We need to get into a proactive mode, but there are how many billions of people on the planet right now? I think it's a lot. 3, 6, what is it? It's a lot. It's more than I can bear. There's a here and now, and then there's a where we're headed. And unfortunately, the here and now is in reactive mode, okay? So as an investor who's at the nexus of, as I said earlier, ethics and investments and making money and making medicine better, for the foreseeable future, these chronic diseases, which I agree with you, that it's not just genetics, it can be tied to lifestyle, it's the inputs, it's the access. For the foreseeable future, and I'm not giving up on your description, we need to address what we have today, which is there is a disparity between my access to the type of health that you're discussing and other people's access. It just is what it is. I would love to address that, and I think we should. What we're talking about today is maybe, a privileged problem. On the other hand, I actually believe that if some of the panelists here are right, it may even the playing field in terms of access to better care, which to me is an ethical concern as much as it is a quality of life concern. But again, when I think about investments, I think about what's the problem in front of me, what's solvable, how can we move it forward so that we're more proactive? I am not ignoring anything you're saying. But if all I do is shoot for where we have to get, there's this bolus that we haven't addressed. And I think we have to be realistic about how to get to that more of a nirvana state. So,
Did you want to add to that, Steve?
No, I did want to thank her for the education on the salmon. I agree with a lot of your points, and I think this balance of how do we deal with the world that we have while proactively, consciously, intentionally trying to construct a better one that we know will take time. I think we have to do both of those. It's not an either or, and so I would agree with what you're saying.
Well, and 1 second. So, you mentioned Dever Davis and when smoke ran like water, and you look at what Pittsburgh was, and the environmental changes that need to happen are still very significant. And I think that this is why this has to be an interdisciplinary approach to health. It can't just be the science of medicine. It has to be looking at all of these factors. So thank you. So Michael.
Hey, Kristen. I'm Michael Catino. I'm a Heinz alumni and currently work at UPMC Enterprises. Something you said, Steve, that was really interesting to me in the work I'm interested in is around the changing brain. So you're talking about how humans can kind of evolve ourselves. And so this old model of the fixed brain theory that you're taught all the way up until 12th grade or through college, and then that's it. Stop learning. But we know now the brain is plastic. And so my question, I think, actually goes to you, Barbara, on how do we understand stimuli and how we can use neuroplasticity and cognitive behavioral therapy to really change how we as humans interact with the environment?
To interact with the environment, meaning the issues that were raised by the previous person?
A little bit, but more from a technology side of how we can use technology to get our brains to that state Steve was talking about.
That's interesting. I'd have to think about it a little bit. It's a small answer to, I think, what is a bigger question. But it's absolutely the case that adult brains are extremely plastic. The kinds of things that can drive plasticity are different when you're an adult versus when you're a child. A child's brain is more plastic, and it becomes kind of stabilized once certain things are learned. And so to change an adult brain requires getting the brain engaged in particular ways. One of the reasons so many people are addicted to games on smartphones is that they are appealing to the reward system in the brain in particular ways. The game designers are incredibly good at building things that engage you, that are enveloping you, and it is because of the reward system in the brain that, when engaged, is part of what drives plasticity even in an adult. So it's actually kind of fun. I mean, you mentioned games and the Entertainment Technology Center here. There's actually was an NSF-funded program where I worked with the ETC even before I came here to develop games that were being used to give people, to train the brain into better abilities. And part of the issue is a lot of things, for the brain to change, it needs repetition. But repetition is not fun. You know, like if I have to change, if I'm a young kid trying to learn not to lisp and I have to practice not lisping and that's the goal, it's really boring. But if I could put that in a game that made it fun, suddenly I get compliance. Suddenly I get a person who's willing to engage with this thing because it's fun. So fun actually translates to rewarding in the brain, which opens up gates. It changes the neurotransmitters in the brain in a way that make them more plastic. This is fun and interesting, changes how the brain reacts, which makes it learn better. So there are definitely some science things one can do to change the brain, but it does speak, it's a little off of what I think Steve was driving at, which is actually changing the architecture of the brain in an evolutionary sense, rather than changing what the capabilities are within the architecture of your brain today. I may be putting words in your mouth.
It's not so much that. You actually stimulated something else that I was
Because it was fun.
Yes. So you engaged my brain in this really
Thank
interesting
God.
way. It actually has to do with this idea of engaging the brain. And as people become more expert and sort of technically proficient at engaging people's brains, I'm starting to wonder if there are some sort of sustainability principles around the brain. In other words, you know, if everybody is sort of targeting the brain in many, many ways, whether it's advertising or gaming or just various ways, you know, I have this sort of slow hunch that there are a lot of people who are really miserable these days, and that's actually kind of growing, and sort of people who sort of theoretically shouldn't be miserable but are miserable. And I'm just sort of wondering about this. Are we sort of over-farming people's brains, you know? And is there something that we, as we think about this increasing technical proficiency, does it need to be tempered with some ethics? You know,
and I think a lot of that has to do with this short-term reward system that is being driven by these games, by, you know, engaged in this very particular way, actually has longer-term consequences for deeper interpersonal relationships and things that are, you know, not something that I know that much about on a science level, but clearly are important for people's well-being. So yes, absolutely. And there's another side. I thought you were going to say something else for a minute, which is we also become inured to things. Novelty is something the brain is drawn to, and that's also something that games are really good about. They know just kind of, you know, they're designed to give you new rewards or infrequent rewards, that the novelty of that is something that is particularly engaging to the brain. And this even ties back to those sirens and alarm systems are really attention grabbing at first until your brain turns it away because it's boring and I know what that is, I don't have to pay attention to it. So there's lots of things embedded in your comment, and yeah.
Another question.
Yes, hello. My name is Clarence Brown. I'm a 91 graduate of Carnegie Mellon in the School of Engineering from Chemical Engineering and Biomedical Sciences. In 95, I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. I now live in Chicago. I'm a private practice physician, and I just recently obtained a JD. I actually wanted to raise, for consideration and to hear your thoughts, about a much more elemental aspect of how artificial intelligence and research and development interacts with who we all are in life and physicians and how healthcare is provided. That I have the impression that today we're all sort of functioning at sort of the uber potential mode. We're all always busy, we're always producing, we're always performing. And I'm so very interested in your thoughts with respect to how do we take those efforts that are often sort of not so productive and free those efforts up, or that time or that energy, to allow other, for it to be directed in other directions for other accomplishments. So as a physician, I want to spend less time assimilating all the little nitty-gritty details that are involved in each patient interaction. I'm very interested in the smart examination room, the interface, between electronic medical record systems, rather than everything existing in a silo that requires a mountain of effort and engagement to go from one to the other. If we can integrate the smallest details of our professional lives, it allows many people to exert, time and energy to accomplishing these much greater goals of, synthetic organs and going to Mars, rather than entering vitals and, spending an extra couple hours a day typing and charting, when I think, why can't this just be audio recorded? Why can't it be video recorded into an electronic medical record? Thank you.
I'm going to let Jeanne answer this, but I want to make a comment. So in the panel earlier, it was about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I think what they were getting at was that, the time spent, it could be a blend. If we're using machine learning, it could be a blend between what the machine can do and what the clinician needs to do. Just real quick, my husband's a pediatric lung specialist, and when people ask him what he does, he says he's a typist. And so, and I think that this is where we're converging with all these technologies, but I'm going to let Jeanne talk a little bit more about that. And perhaps
boy, I love what he does, though. Anybody who manages...
What, a typist?
Yeah. So it's really apropos, because UPMC, and especially within UPMC, there's my group, this translational sciences within enterprises, which is the venture arm, and on the other side is digital, is exactly the marriage of the types of examples you gave. We don't see the physician as, we're trying to anyway, not see him as or her as the typist. And if you could see some of the clinicians' notes, you write them all the time, I'm sure they're useless, right? They're the most important piece, and they're hard to interpret. And they're not standardized, and it's hard to translate that. So we have taken an approach where we believe marrying what we call the structured data with the unstructured, such as clinicians' notes, with your omics, imaging, all your health record, and that includes your lifestyle, right? The ultimate here is to have every bit of information so that your job is more about interpretation and the what if and managing in terms of more qualitative, the quantitative stuff should take care of itself. So, but we're not there yet, and the hardest part of this, I think, is going to be the unstructured piece, that inferencing of what's in the notes, what do they truly mean. But we have actually started a company that's working. There's a lot of companies out there that have access to patient health information. You see them. They get loads and loads and loads and loads of records. The approach we've taken is we would curate the information so that it's more tailored, so that we can more easily come up with, hopefully the ultimate goal would be discoveries, so that you, the practitioner, can match the drug to the patient and not have this huge mass appeal. What are the biomarkers, the biochemicals in the body that dictate what type of cardiovascular disease I'm going to develop or have? So we really are marrying and blurring the lines so that what we call I'll call it I think when I first joined Amy, it was the clinician liberator, so that you can actually practice medicine and advising and inferencing with your patients. But it is a huge push. And I just want to say that I came from San Francisco, a year ago, and moved here. And we're supposed to be the tech hub of the world, but Pittsburgh seems to be a bit more advanced than most places, but between Carnegie, yeah, right? Ask me about your food, water, and air, and there's a different answer. But
I just moved here a year ago. I'm with you.
And I said, I need to go visit the mayor, and someone said, Jeanne, the mayor doesn't control that. Who does? I don't know, but if you all know, I'm happy to have a discussion. But we seem to be at the forefront of understanding, or hoping, I shouldn't say this, the forefront of pursuing the marriage between what it means to be human and that interaction with your GP or your specialist and all of the greatest parts, the elements of access to the information about your health, right? That data and how we use it and how we interact with patients. I mean, it's, again, I think the intersection with Pitt and Carnegie Mellon and UPMC makes it a special place for that.
Well, I think it's especially important because, we talked earlier about, the shortage of healthcare providers because of the burnout. And part of that burnout, I think, is because they're not just doing medicine. They're doing all of these other things. And so I think that it's especially important if we want to, have the new generation really embrace becoming healthcare providers. We need to make sure that we do whatever we can in this realm.
I agree.
Yeah. So another question?
Hi, I'm a recent alum of Tepper, and I come from a humanities background, so I think that one of the things I think about as you brought all of these issues up, especially around, like what the practitioner really enjoys about their job, and perhaps also what patients yearn for when they go to someone who's supposed to be helping them heal. I've been reading on my own about, the placebo effect and what we're learning about the brain, about psilocybin and some of the sort of experiments around healing addiction with also changes in how your brain works. So that's a whole other thing, but it's made me think about the issue of trust that is so much a part of the healing experience, and about the science that's kind of backing up like what's going on a cellular level when you trust someone, and et cetera. Goes back to some of the Abridge AI comments about sharing your story and having your story understood. But you see like epigenetics changing at that level when someone is connecting in that way. So I think that one of the things I'm curious about, because I love technology and what we're able to do and all our capabilities, but I find that in human history we tend to have a lot of hubris about what we know and not a lot of insight into what we don't know. So I'm expecting that we're going to start doing all sorts of crazy stuff to the brain before we really understand it. But I'm wondering what you see in terms of people in the field thinking about, realizing how little we understand what is the function of emotions, like what purpose do they serve instead of just being an impediment, what's going on with like the placebo effect and trust and like healing, and what are our blind spots, especially in the West. I think we have this problem reactive kind of mental model for health versus maybe a more Eastern balance preventative model. And so I'm just curious about like what the conversations are that are happening around what we can technically do with all of our kind of new insights into what we are discovering with sensors, et cetera, versus what we really don't understand yet, and how we're gonna blend those things in terms of the future. Telemedicine is gonna happen, but what form will it take? So, thank you.
Can I just say that I thought it was an absolutely brilliant set of comments, and I kind of want to give my seat to you so we can hear more from you. I think this question about humility about what we know about health and well-being is absolutely critical and fundamental, because I think that and you referenced the placebo effect, and one of the people that we funded at Robert Johnson Foundation is Ted Kapchuk, who's done some really groundbreaking work on the placebo effect. And I feel like there's a lot of things that we encounter in health and well-being that aren't easily explained by the paradigms and the science that we're sort of believe in and are grounded in. My sense about science is when things don't square with the theory, it's a really important time to then reflect on the theory and ask how the theory needs to be extended or revisited. And I think, so again, I just really wanted to underscore what you said is that, Shiv earlier mentioned something about Joseph Campbell's saying about change the metaphor, change the tools. And I think that whether it's the metaphor or the mental models or the mindsets we have about certain aspects of health and well-being and healthcare, is that as we think to the future, I think we're going to have to let go of some of them. We're going to have to replace them. We're going to have to challenge them, because whether it's about, sort of what kind of organs we put in us, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have disease? Mean to be enhanced? All of these things, I think, are going to become questioned. So we actually that's my ramble on that. I'm sorry.
So we have to keep the human in all of this. Yeah. You have to keep the human, and that's the balance at some point, right? So we could mimic emotions, or could we? But could we ever mimic the judgment and the learning that we do from that little consciousness that, I don't know, Barbara, you tell me, but I'm not sure we could,
And I'd say the science of understanding the importance of emotion it lags a lot of other parts of neuroscience, in part because it's not the kind of thing that people feel is kind of a core question, but we all know that it is. And the piece of that that's easy to understand at a high level is that the brain is very interactive. It is, your emotions are not independent of the brain state, and the brain state changes your physiology, it changes your body. That's why the placebo effect works, for instance. Literal stress actually causes inflammation, right? And that's a mental state. You're stressed because you're upset in your head about thinking about things, which is then causing physiological real changes. So that science, some of it is starting to become looked at in more detail, but it really does lag behind a lot of the other neuroscience that's going on, I'd say.
So I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and everything seemed so certain when I was in my mechanical engineering classes. Like, this is the theory, and it's been worked on for hundreds of years, and it's absolutely correct. And so, when I get into teaching here, I spend a lot of time telling students how uncertain everything, every bit of knowledge that I'm presenting is. And I think most students find that strange and sometimes a little bit funny. But it really is true. The amount we don't know is so gigantic compared to what we do. And even the things we think we know are going to change. And I think that it's best that students understand that as early as possible.
Thank you.
And aren't intimidated by it. That's the thing. Like, rather than being intimidated and stopped by that, it's that cynical piece. Rather than being stopped by what we don't know, we have to have the fortitude to persevere, kind of. That's where change comes from.
Another question?
Yeah. I'm Dr. Burrell, one of the clinicians. I'm starting my MMM next week. So I'll probably be seeing you and others.
You'll be my student in a month.
Yes, I'm glad. The question I have is along the same lines. One is on placebo. That I know in irritable bowel syndrome, being a GI doctor, the placebo response rate is almost 40–45%, and that poses one of the problems that we don't have a good medication, because against that tremendous placebo response rate for irritable bowel syndrome, it's difficult to come up with a medication that will do better than that. Is there any? So there are many conditions where if we can't make them better, can we make them feel better at least? Can we use that placebo response in other ways for diseases which are either incurable or difficult to come up with medications for?
But I'd just like to interject, the placebo effect is making them better.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. It's a physical thing. It's just not caused by medicine. It goes back to the Eastern versus Western divide almost. The mind is changing the body.
That's right.
And that is a treatment in its own right, perhaps.
Right.
It's just not the one we want to identify, that the healthcare system can't, reimburse for that very well, maybe.
And that is a problem.
So I mentioned Ted Kapchuk earlier, and one of the experiments he did, because this just blows my mind, he kept kind of raising the bar in terms of how much he would out the fact that he was using a placebo on the patient. And so at one point he finally said, all right, I'm going to pretend to inject you with a fake needle. Are you ready for me to pretend to inject you with the fake needle? Here goes. And people got better. Right? It's challenges your thinking.
And the second quick question was suicide. One of the major public health problems is suicide, and how the brain chemistry has to change for somebody to lose their life, especially, say, a young age, as compared to a 90-year-old who still wants to live. And we come across these patients, we ask them, what do you want? They say, everything. They want to live forever. And on the other hand, younger people commit suicide. Sometimes they have billions of dollars and they still commit suicide. So where is the disconnect in the brain where that happens, and have we identified that, and are we able to use it to prevent that? Thank you.
I'll just jump in and say, since I'm the neuroscientist on the panel, this is one of those things I don't know.
Yeah.
It goes back, I don't study that, I don't really know.
It's so complicated.
Yeah.
It's so complicated. It is, it was rare that we all knew someone who took their life. It's not that rare. And so it can't be just something going on inside me. It has to be external. And then the question is, as we evolve as humans, is it more and more that there's something more going on inside that wasn't going on before? It's just so complicated.
It's an issue that really needs to be looked at in today's healthcare, though. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you. My name is Betsy Monroe. I am a CMU spouse and parent, although my master's in business and health administration came from Pitt. So my question, I wanted to tie it back to the keynote again, because that was really inspiring. You were talking about how we evolved for an environment that is radically different than the one that we live in now. And the way that we evolved was it developed chemical and hormone and releases to reward us for good behaviors, okay? So that, I'm wondering, you talked about Pokemon Go and about, there are some, chemicals and hormones that do reward good behaviors, but not enough now, and there are, but, and it competes with chemicals and hormones that are released by our bodies when we make bad decisions or decisions that are now bad for our health, like being sedentary, like conserving our physical energy. Other than Pokemon Go, or my first question was, we have the Pokemon Go and we have the Apple Watches and the Fitbits that give you information and, kudos when you make those good decisions or perform those good behaviors. Do we have data on how effective those are at creating?
Yeah, so I want to make a distinction that I think is very important, and it's the difference between sort of pulling versus pushing and shaping the environment versus pushing the behavior. And so I actually distinguish Pokemon Go, although there is, obviously it's a game, there's gamification with it and all of that. I distinguish that from the Fitbit and the Apple Watch because Pokemon Go is actually, although I think they've veered into this a little bit lately, but is not meant to get you to do healthy things. It's to get you to play the game. But it...
And spend money.
Yeah, for sure. But the point of it is that it is entertainment that you do because you're motivated by the entertainment, and it pulls along behaviors like movement and being outdoors and being social. Whereas Fitbit and Apple Watch are very much explicitly targeted to say, hey, you need to get more steps, go out and get more steps, and here's a little tone or a circle closing to say that a reward, in effect. And so I wanted to make a real distinction about that. I don't, at this moment, I think my sense, and I haven't looked very closely lately, but there's not a lot of good evidence that suggests that, use of wearables and apps that reward behavior have a population level impact that's of any significance. I mean, obviously, there are many individual stories that people tell about how it helped them, but the net of it is not so much. I think actually Niantic, who runs Pokemon Go, has done some studies in terms of persistent, more physical activity from people who play the game than who don't. So they've shown some persistent effects from that. I mean, overall health, probably not, but more activity at any rate.
And then the sort of culmination of this was more on the science fiction sort of perspective. Are there other technologies, either like a tech focus or a bio focus, that work to change our internal reward systems to conform to our environment better?
I was going to ask.
I'm looking at you. She's talking to you.
Well,
I don't know. If I knew a neuroscientist,
Well,
boy, I really don't know.
but So
the
let's
answer
think
to that.
about this, because I think I'm getting the cue to wrap up. So let's face it, technology is here to stay. I mean, my watch was yelling at me as I'm sitting up here saying, you need to stand. Does anybody else feel guilty, by the way, that their watches,
We would have all understood
I
if
know.
you stood up.
I was going to stay. But it's interesting. I have a friend who I saw over the summer who had a hearing aid put in, and he said, I love this. He said, because now I'm listening to my Audible books through my hearing aid. He said, and as I'm walking my dog, I'm listening to my book, and I go an extra, couple times around the block because I want to finish up another chapter. So, I think at this point, we need to just accept these technologies, and, hopefully now it's been 10 plus years with the iPhone being out, that we're beginning to get used to these in the technology. But I think it's also that, society has to recognize that we do need this off time. I know even in my own classroom, I say to my students, I don't really check my emails after 6 o'clock because, I need that downtime and I need my time to, spend with my family. So I think it's partly the technologies are here, but it's partly setting boundaries for yourself and letting others know that it's okay to not necessarily embrace all of those technologies to the extreme. So, and I can say this because I actually invented the iPhone in 1975. I did. It was called the anything thing. And I was, as kids used to play in 1975 out in the yards with my friend, and I took a Tic Tac box. You guys know Tic Tac boxes? Oh, yeah. I wrapped paper around it, and I said, this is going to be my TV and my phone and my radio. And I called it the anything thing. So unfortunately, I did not
patent it.
And I did not do anything with.
It was a little shy of technical detail, though.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs was walking his dog by you.
That's right. Anyway, so I would like to thank the panelists. You can see it was a really diverse group here, and I hope that you guys enjoyed the Mystery Science Theater today. And we have a break until about 3 o'clock, so I encourage you guys to go out and ask more questions of the panelists, and we'll be starting back here at 3 o'clock sharp.